Hey, work from homers, Adam Schroeder here. We love bringing you this podcast, and thousands of you have proven that it's been helpful for you. But since time and online storage space aren't free, Naresh and I wanted to come to you personally to ask for your financial support through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/workfromhomeshow and help support the show. And we appreciate your support at any amount you choose. That's patreon.com/workfromhomeshow. Thanks for your support. Let's get to the show.
Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Schroeder. Today we have one of my former professors at Syracuse University's Martin J. Whitman School of Management. He's a professor of entrepreneurial practice there. His name is John Torrens. He is the author of a brand new book which delves into a topic which many of our listeners have had to cope with, and that is ADHD. The book is called Lightning in a Bottle: How Entrepreneurs Can Harness Their ADHD to Win. And like I said, we cover all sorts of topics, and we've never covered this topic. And so many of our listeners think they might have ADHD. Some of them have been diagnosed with ADHD. So I thought, let's bring Professor Torrens on the show, talk shop about the good old days, and it's been about 10 years since I've spoken to him. So, Professor Torrens, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Thank you so much, Naresh. Really great to be here with you.
Yeah, and again, to let our listeners know, I took your entrepreneurship class in my senior year, as most business students at Syracuse. They take it their senior year. It's the capstone entrepreneurship project. And I got to say, that class was awesome because, number one, it was probably my first introduction into real world case studies of people like Howard Schultz and Bill Gates and these well-known, Steve Jobs, these well-known entrepreneurs who started big companies. But it also was, it was really cool because you actually got to start or try to start a real business when you were still in college, instead of waiting until you're 30, 35, 40 years old and learning the process and failing. I think doing it when you're 21 years old, I was 21 when I took your class. It helped me. It gave me that leg up so that when I was 24 years old and I started my first company, I was ready to hit the ground running. And I was 6 figures cash flow positive my first year. I think I don't want to say it was only because of your class or only because of the capstone, but it certainly did help a lot.
That's fantastic to hear. Great. And yeah, we'll take a little bit of credit for it, but you deserve some too.
Yeah. Well, I will also say one thing, and maybe we should start with this topic regarding entrepreneurship before we get into the ADHD. One thing about, and I think this is how the class was designed, but one thing I learned, not during the class, but many years later, not maybe 4 or 5 years later, is you don't need to have a new novel Facebook, Snapchat, Uber type of idea to become a successful entrepreneur. And I think if I remember correctly, your background, like on the first day of class, I think you started like a speech pathology. You were like a speech pathologist, and you just started out on your own. And then as you got more clients, you hired more people, and it turned into a business, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And you had a company years later, and then you sold it. Am I correct when I say that?
Yeah, that is an incredible memory you have. But yeah, that is it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, look, like being a speech pathologist is not a, Steve Jobs, Apple innovative entrepreneurial idea, but that's what I learned many years later, is that you don't have to be the Zuckerberg or the Steve Jobs. In my case, my first company, which started out as just me, a one-man freelancing independent consultant. Now it's a full-service online and digital marketing agency. Again, nothing new and novel. There are tens of thousands of similar companies to mine around the world. I mean, maybe hundreds of thousands. But I was able to carve out a niche for myself in the financial industry and find ways to beat my competition and still make a living. And that's a point that I want to make here. It's that you can be a speech pathologist or a teacher or a music teacher or a marketing consultant, and you can create a business out of it and become an entrepreneur that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, most fast-growing companies are just new spins on old ideas. You know, it's you just do something better, or you meet a need or resolve a pain for a customer in a way that's better than those next best alternatives, and you're off to the races. So yeah, that's a great. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is my second company, and Adam is also involved in the sense that he started the same type of company, and that is a real estate investment company. And there is nothing new or novel about investing in real estate. I mean, here down in Florida, almost everyone you meet is like a real estate agent. But on the investment side, I'm not an agent, although we both, Adam and I, do have real estate licenses. We're both heavy investors in properties, or at least we're trying to become more heavy. And again, I mean, it cash flows well. The company cash flows well, the properties cash flow well, it comes with a bunch of amazing tax benefits, and that's entrepreneurship too. That's entrepreneurial, that's entrepreneurship. But sure. I think people have been investing in real estate since the beginning of mankind, so there's nothing new and novel here. And so I just want to stress, sometimes the stuff that's already working, if you just copy it, it could work out for you too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and remember, the definition of entrepreneurship is simply that you're exploiting an opportunity without regards to the resources you control, and that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, well, let's now get into ADHD. Your book, Lightning in a Bottle: How Entrepreneurs Can Harness Their ADHD to Win. So let's start from the beginning. Do you have ADHD?
I do, and I was diagnosed as an adult when my company was scaling. So as you mentioned, I was a speech pathologist. I had a private practice, and I suddenly realized that my income was going to be limited to the number of hours in my day, which didn't seem all that cool to me. So I just began hiring people as I could, and I remember I probably was at the point where I had maybe 10 or 12 employees. It wasn't a huge company at that point, but I remember having difficulty with people that were working for me where before things were going great, and now all of a sudden we started to have some friction. And I remember at the time I was working with a CEO coach, and she suggested that maybe I'd talk to somebody about possible ADHD. So what was happening was all the things that I was really good at the early stage of the venture, the hustling and the selling and acquiring the resources I needed and getting contracts, those tapped into my ADHD super well, and I was doing what I was born to do, basically. Then when we got into the stage where we needed a little more rigor, some policies and some procedures and things like that, that's where it started to fall apart. And my key employees I was driving them absolutely crazy. So we were doubling our sales every quarter. Things were great. And then we hit this plateau, and it wasn't until I realized that, I've had ADHD my whole life. I'm just realizing it now. And the reason I was realizing it is because it was starting to get in my way. And the things that I used to be good at, now they're not even relevant in the business anymore. And I had to adopt a new mindset. So, the evaluation process, I saw a psychiatrist, and it was actually kind of fun. We did an interview, an observation. I had my parents send me all my elementary school report cards, and one of the comments that was super frequent on the report cards was, things to the effect of, John's got so much great potential if he'd only apply himself, or, he gets his work done quickly and then distracts the other students, or he blurts answers out in class and doesn't raise his hand, right? So as we were going through all this, the doctor was like, this has been your whole life. It's just starting to impact you now. And I tried the medication route, didn't really work with me, so I went with other compensations. So then, as I started to get more into this, one of my faculty colleagues, Johan Wickland, he does a lot of research onto this very topic. And we had lunch one day, and we just decided to collaborate on a neat little study. And from there, we just kind of kept going. And there are some contexts in entrepreneurship where your ADHD traits can be a super advantage, but you also have to manage the times where they can get in your way. And that's kind of what it's about.
So when you talk about ADHD now, are you talking about people who are just diagnosed, or are you talking about just kind of like some of the traits people think about when you think about ADHD? And then in general, what kind of percentage of the population would you say has ADHD? Because it seems like something that the diagnosis has exploded in the past, 15, 20 years, whereas whenever, Naresh and I were, in high school, at least when I was, when he was, it was a little more, prevalent. But whenever I was in high school and middle school and stuff, it wasn't something people were diagnosed with. So what percentage would you say of people actually have ADHD? And then is your book and your stuff kind of just about the tendencies, or for people who actually have ADHD?
Right. So we were looking at behaviors. So part of what we did in the study was we looked at a sample of highly successful entrepreneurs, people who had companies doing more than $13 million in sales and more than 50 employees. And some of them did have formal diagnoses, but what we had them do is complete the ADHD self-reporting scale, which is standardized test used by the World Health Organization and a bunch of other providers. And it basically is it's a rating scale. You rate yourself, high efficacy. And it basically tells you whether or not you have traits consistent with the diagnosis and whether or not you should see a provider. So with that, the people who would identify with traits consistent with an ADHD diagnosis, in that population, 62% of the people identified with those traits, whereas in the general population, it's about 12%. So you're right, there is more diagnosis, and there's more environmental factors. I mean, we're just more distractible now because we have more screens and more, digital information and that kind of thing. But it's partly because we just didn't know better back then, right? So there's an aspect of neurodiversity here that's really important. And part of the message that I think is important for me is that it is a diversity issue, right? It can be a completely debilitating position or condition for a lot of people. But in the context of entrepreneurship, it seems to work really well for some people.
And can you tell us more about that? How can, in your book, you call ADHD an entrepreneur's superpower? How?
It's a good question, right? So if you look at some of the most prominent entrepreneurs we know, right? Richard Branson, David Neilman from JetBlue, on and on. These people have. Paul Orfalea, he attributes his business success to his ADHD because of the way he's wired and the way he operates and the way he interacts with the world, right? And it's important to note too that what we're finding is that it's really just the hyperactive and impulsive presentation of ADHD that has advantages in the context of entrepreneurship. The inattentive type of ADHD tends not to work so well with entrepreneurship, and those are the types of traits that you really have to manage in order to tap into the good ones. But for example, if you think of people who have some of these traits, right? So some of them are a high propensity for risk, highly proactive, high sense of urgency, low premeditation, high sensation seeking, high impulsivity, right? Most of the entrepreneurs probably have some of those going on, right? And there's instances where it works really well and can help you tremendously, but there's also instances where it can be very harmful. So let's just take high propensity for risk, right? So if you're an entrepreneur and you have this trait, you have a high propensity for risk, when it's helpful to you and when it's functional, it could make you look brave and visionary and that sort of thing. But when it's harmful, it could make you look really reckless and it could have serious downsides, right? So there's definitely implications on both sides of the fence there. Likewise with this high impulsivity, when it's working well for you and it's functional, it could make you capitalize on new opportunities that other people aren't even aware of yet. But when it's dysfunctional and harmful, it could cause you to take actions that you're just going to regret later. right? So everything has this yin and yang.
Yeah, and talking about risk, I don't know if this ties into. First off, I've never gotten tested for ADHD, and maybe I feel like I need to call my mom now and ask her if she can find my old report cards, progress reports. But regarding risk, it's strange, and I don't know, maybe you can answer this better based on some research. But when I got my first company started, people thought, like my friends, family members, were like, "Oh, you're taking a risk," and I didn't think it was a risk at all. It was a no-brainer because it was a side hobby for me, and I left my full-time job, and that side hobby, within a month, it's like I gave myself a 20% raise. So I was like, how is this a risk? Like, I'm making more money than what I was making working at a job, and I work from home, and I can create my own schedule, and I have a lot of free time. So that's what I thought. And then when I got into the real estate investing, same thing. I mean, I would say over 95% of the people I met were like, oh, wow, that's risky. You're going to have to take out loans and mortgages, and you're going to have tenants who are going to destroy your house. And this is a huge risk that you're taking. But I looked at it as I was like, actually, I think I'm taking like close to zero risk. Like, this is the easiest investment anyone could make. Like, why isn't everyone else doing it? Like, they're not going to destroy my house because I'm not going to bring in people who are going to. And I am going to take out loans and take out mortgages to buy the properties, but it's guaranteed cash flow I'm going to be getting when a tenant's in there, and I'm going to be making money off of it. Like, it's maybe 1 month of vacancy is the risk that you're going to be taking on. I mean, if the house burns down, well, the insurance is going to cover that. I just saw no risk in anything that I did, but other people saw a lot of risk, and that's why they're not doing any of this stuff.
A lot of times, part of this risk taking among entrepreneurs, part of it is that we just tend not to perceive risk in the same way that other people do, right? So just like you said, in your mind, that was a no-brainer. What risk are you really taking? But for somebody else, they might say, look, just signing my name on a mortgage is too much risk for me, right? And so it's a level of comfort that maybe we have. And of course, entrepreneurs are involved in risk mitigation, right? Not wild risk taking. So we come up with the worst case scenario, kind of like you mentioned, and as long as you're comfortable with it, you're good to go, But it's that that whole opportunity recognition and interest in entrepreneurship and attraction to it, those are areas in the early stages of a company's life cycle that are really helpful for entrepreneurs with ADHD.
So when you talk about kind of keeping the worst parts of ADHD, from destroying your business, does that involve kind of acknowledging things about yourself, or does that involve usually bringing in people who kind of, deal with those things for you? Or kind of what's usually the best way for entrepreneurs to go about doing that? Because I feel like the downside, the negative parts of it could impact you pretty significantly compared to kind of the positives.
Yeah, they can have drastic effects, right? So we know that people with ADHD are much more likely to lose their jobs or get poor performance reviews by their employers. They're more likely to have infidelity and get divorced and things like that. But on the other hand, in our study at least, they're more likely to have larger companies than non-ADHD entrepreneurs. They grow their sales faster. They have a higher level of what we call entrepreneurial orientation in their companies, which also leads to better business performance. So there is a lot of upside as well. But normally, so I coach entrepreneurs with ADHD on a one-on-one basis. And a lot of times it's just a matter of having that unemotional accountability partner, somebody who can call you out and say, hey, we just spent a week going over this strategic plan and we set these priorities, and now what are you talking about, right? This has nothing to do with what we were talking about, right? Or deputize somebody within their organization, like a strong chief operating officer or number two, to be that person and give them permission to raise the flag when they're acting in a way that's not consistent with the positive parts of their traits. So having a partner for your accountability is super important.
Yeah, and going back to risk, can you tell us why people with ADHD tend to take, is it that risk means nothing to them? And also it reminds me, like you said, some people signing a tiny little loan, that's a huge risk for them. But tying this into like the pandemic, maybe, I don't know if you've done any studies on this or if you've looked into how entrepreneurs or people with ADHD reacted to the pandemic. But I was one of those people who was like, look, it's my life, my body, and I've done my research, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to play my tennis. And if I get invited somewhere, I'm going to go. Like, if I get the virus, I get the virus, and I'll suck it up for a few days and move on with life. And people were like, how can you take that risk? And my response is, look, you have a greater chance of dying in a car crash than you do from this thing. How can you take the risk of getting in a car? I'm actually more terrified of driving than I am getting this virus, because I have been in a bad car. I've been in several car crashes. I've been in one really bad one, and I've had nightmares about it. And it's one of my main fears. But guess what? I've got places to go. I can't just box myself in at home and not go anywhere. Like, you have to get in a car to get somewhere and to get things done and to enjoy life.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there. So one of the things that the research shows is that entrepreneurs with ADHD, yes, they do take risks, but there's a difference in their perception of it, right? So they don't necessarily perceive risks to the same level as somebody without ADHD. And a lot of it could just be overexuberance for the idea, right? Because if you're super excited about something, you may just take this really optimistic look at it and only see the upsides and not see the downsides. So somebody who's a little more risk averse, they may focus on all the things that could possibly go wrong, whereas the entrepreneur is really focusing on everything about it that's going to go right, and thereby missing some of the downsides and, getting into a riskier situation than somebody who doesn't have ADHD, for example.
Now, I noticed in your CV, you're also an investor and a consultant for a lot of some cannabis companies. Is there a connection between cannabis and the entrepreneurship, or are those just two separate things for you?
Yeah, well, so as an entrepreneur and an entrepreneurship professor, when cannabis started to become decriminalized, I thought it was a fantastic opportunity. I mean, as an entrepreneur, what could be better than being part of an industry that's being born right in front of your eyes, right? So, I had a friend in California who called me and told me about this idea. So I guess I've been an investor in this company for about 6 or 7 years now. And when I heard it, I was all in. I was like, this is great. I love it. It was the easiest capital I've ever raised. People were just, falling over themselves to get involved, So, yeah, but there was tremendous risk in that, mostly because of federal prohibition, right? We are getting into a business that the federal government still said was illegal, even though the state of California said it was okay. So, but yeah, so I've done that. I've been an early stage investor in a telemedicine company. And I just actually yesterday just signed a deal to buy a former competitor back, because my non-compete was up in March for my company I exited a couple of years ago. So, we can't help ourselves, right? That's one of the things we noticed in our study too, is that entrepreneurs with ADHD are more likely to be serial entrepreneurs. And as a matter of fact, in the study we did, people who responded to it, ADHD entrepreneurs were much more likely to be in the process of starting a second company or a third company at the time that you're filling out the survey, right? So it's not that you just start a company and grow it and run it, but you start a company, you start another one, you exit one you had, you start another one, you invest in a different one. There's always something going on.
Sounds familiar for sure, Professor Torrens. So we're the work from home show, and you work at Syracuse University, Martin J. Whitman School of Management. Has a lot of the learning been e-learning this year, or are they back?
Yeah, it has been. So, because of the social distancing requirements in the classrooms, we've had to limit the number of students that can come into class. We've had some classes that just went totally remote. Students who aren't comfortable being on campus can participate from home via Zoom. So it's been a very remote situation for sure.
Well, that tees up the next question, which is, What opportunities have you seen in the entrepreneurial space when it comes to the idea of remote work, working from home? Have you seen a lot of good innovation? And do you think that there are more opportunities than ever for our listeners who are at home listening to jump into the entrepreneurial space?
I do, but I'm optimistic, and I think that anyway, not just because of the pandemic, right? I think the pandemic was a great accelerator to working at home because people really had no choice. But just for example, when when schools were closed, you saw teachers who maybe were retired starting to make more money than they ever did teaching for a year by being like a private teacher for a group of families that said, hey, we still need our kids to get an education, so let's just hire this teacher privately, bring him or her to the house and have 6 kids there or something, right? So even something as, I don't want to say basic, but something as old school and brick and mortar as primary education benefited from this innovation if you had that mindset, for example, right?
A lot of our listeners haven't yet started their own business. They're still, maybe they're working from home, but they haven't gone out and done the final step of starting their own company. So take us to like day one of your entrepreneur class. Kind of what are some of the basics that you would say that people need to know about it in order to kind of get out and start on their own?
Yeah, sure. So the basics, what we do on day one is we talk about that you have to solve a problem or alleviate a pain for a specific customer. Now, there are certain times where maybe that doesn't apply, but for the most part, if you're not solving a problem or alleviating a pain, you probably should start over, right? So identify a problem that needs to be solved. Identify who suffers from that problem and how they're currently solving it for themselves, because people who have problems are solving it. Then you've got to evaluate whether or not your idea or how your idea is better than those next best alternatives. So if you can identify the problem, know who suffers it, know how they solve it for themselves now, and understand how your solution is better than those alternatives, you're more than half the way there. And that's the first couple of weeks of students just evaluating that, thinking of different problems, validating it with some of the potential customers out there in the market, and going from there.
Going back to ADHD, can you share some tips on how to manage ADHD, both in the workplace and also personally? You brought up marriages, relationships, friendships. What tips do you have?
Right. So I kind of use this model that's based on our activity and our consumption, right? So if you think of your activity, right, what are the things that you're doing, both work-wise and with your body? So are you doing things in your work life that you were built to do, or are you doing things that you absolutely hate just because you have to, right? That's a really important thing to get to the bottom of. And then in terms of what you do with your body, it's super important for people with ADHD to incorporate a movement practice every day for a variety of reasons, right? Neurotransmitters, endorphins, getting the ants in the pants out, whatever, right? So that's your activity. And then on the consumption side, not only what you're putting into your body through your mouth, right? And we know the science tells us that you can do much more good for yourself by eliminating things than you can by adding things to your diet, right? So taking supplements and things like that aren't going to be as helpful as eliminating certain things like red dye, sugar, and caffeine, right? And then also on the consumption side, limiting what we're consuming in terms of media. So are you the person that's got 4 monitors, one with WhatsApp for web, one's got your stock ticker, one's got realtor.com, and the other one's got your Outlook up? Or are you able to turn all that stuff off and focus, right? What type of media do you consume? How frequently do you consume it? Do you set aside time where you just work on projects without all of those distractions? So think about what you're doing in terms of activity and think about what you're consuming. And when you bring those two things together, they tend to yield results. And I go into a couple of chapters of that in my book too. And it's one of those things I work with right away with my one-on-one coaching clients. We do a consumption audit, right? We say, take a picture of your desktop for me. Show me how many screens you got going on. Tell me what kind of news you read. First thing in the morning when you wake up, do you check your messages? The joke I use is, do you check your messages while you're peeing or while you're still laying in bed, right? So the point is give yourself some time before you get all into that, right? And plan your day and then let the messages hit your inbox.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is the age, the society that we live in today. Like, to answer your question, I do check my messages while peeing. I do take my phone. My phone is next to me when I sleep. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, especially when you're taking care of a 14-month-old and he wakes up in the middle of the night. What are you going to do when you put him back to sleep? You're going to take that phone out and see what you missed over the last 4 hours or 3 hours.
Right.
And I don't think it's an ADHD thing. I think it's just the society that we live in. I remember, Adam, I think you only got a smartphone like 3 or 4 years ago.
No, it was more than that, but I was late to the game because I didn't want one.
Yeah, and people would make fun of you because you didn't have a smartphone. And sometimes I'm just like, man,
life was better.
Like, yeah.
Well, yeah. So it's not necessarily, so you're not checking your phone because you have ADHD, for example, but imagine somebody who does, right? Imagine what that could do to them. So, say you've got something really important you're working on, right? You're working on some content for a blog, or you're working on a budget for your job, or whatever it is, something that requires your attention, and you have Outlook up. And you get a message, and now you say, whoa, look, I've got to attend to this message now. And then that becomes the thing that you need to do and attracts all your attention. So normally functioning people who don't suffer from ADHD can do this just fine, right? But if you're wired in such a way where you're more prone to distractions, we've got to really eliminate those and manage them as well as we can, so that way you can focus on the things you need to focus on and do what you need to do to succeed.
Yeah, I will say I looked at one of the things that Google has on their Pixel is you can look at how many like notifications you get a day. And I was looking yesterday, I think it was, and I average, it's somewhere along the lines of like 180 to 220 notifications a day from my phone. And if you're not managing that, if you're looking at every single one as soon as it comes up, you're not going to do anything else.
Right, you won't have time, or you lose all of that creative energy and momentum you've built up, right? It's really hard for people. Yeah, I mean, and especially the people I work with one-on-one, that is one of the very first things we do, right? We get them to turn off Outlook unless they need to write an email. We get them to turn off notifications on their phone so they don't get notified when a text or a WhatsApp or a Telegram comes in, and it's more of a pull than a push,
Great. Well, this has been an awesome discussion, Professor John Torrens, Professor of Entrepreneurial Practice at Syracuse University's Martin J. Whitman School of Management and author of Lightning in a Bottle, How Entrepreneurs Can Harness Their ADHD to Win. The book is available on Amazon. Professor Torrens, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners, or anything else you want to promote?
No, thank you for plugging the book. I appreciate it. And thanks for mentioning the Whitman School too. We're super excited and proud of our entrepreneurship program. And thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah, well, I'm an alum. I'm a graduate of the Whitman School, so I'm a fan. Learned a lot while I was there. Syracuse in general, great school. Highly recommended. I was also part of the Newhouse School. That's why I'm a podcaster now. But good school, upstate. Living up in the cold weather was a great experience as well. I now live in Florida. I had enough after 4 years, so I said Florida it is. But outside of that, Professor Torrens, thanks so much for joining us on our show. And to all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list. We're giving away all sorts of goodies free of charge if you get on our mailing list. Like us on social media, Facebook, Twitter. You can check us out on Spotify, TuneIn, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, everywhere podcasts are. Leave us a review there. If you have any questions, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com for all of your questions and comments. And until next week, keep on working from home.